Hello, everyone. My name is Erica Richardson, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our last session of the Black Futures Symposium, Black Ecologies. So the Black Futures Symposium is part of a larger public knowledge project that we've been conducting at Baruch since last spring. Last spring, we began with Black Futures, Black Studies, Black Ecologies, and African Social Research. With this project, not only did we put on different events, but we had students respond to the work of different scholars. Topics included the history and ecologies and philosophy of maroon communities, anti-racist pedagogy, Black feminism and aquatic life, and scavenging as a means of interrupting racial capitalism. We were able to conduct this work with the generous support of the Provost Faculty Research Innovation Grant. This semester, we are so fortunate to have the support of the Program on African Social Research, or PASIRI, as well as the the CUNY College Black Race Ethnic Studies Initiative Grant, which is supporting students' response to the work of our scholars. So if you haven't reached out to your students or other members of the Baruch community, please let students know that following all of these sessions, recordings will be made available, and students will be asked to create public intellectual content in the form of blogs, podcasts, and video blogs, as well as creative and critical work, perhaps something like artwork or poetry. All of this material will be consolidated and put on a public website so that we can share this information and continue to grow and expand our thinking around these topics, especially around Black ecologies. And just for your reference, I'm now going to drop into the chat the link containing our site and all this information about the Black Futures Scholars Program as well. So I will now hand it over to my wonderful colleague, Shelly Eversley. Shelly.
Thank you, Erica Richardson, and thank you, Zachariah Mavhunga, for organizing and bringing Dr.Chakanetsa Mavhunga. I'm going to hang on to the Nesta part, the Robert Nesta Marley O.M.
All right, I'm Mr. Marley. That's fine.
It's a good legacy to invoke in this conversation about Black futures and about centering the knowledge production by Africans and African knowledge when we talk about Africa. So thank you very much, Dr. Chakanetsa Mavhunga. And I will also be here to moderate questions after Dr. Mavhunga's talk. So if you have questions, you can always add them to the chat whenever, and I will be taking notes so that we can jump right in after his presentation. Dr. Mavhunga is a professor of science, technology, and society at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. His latest book, Knowledge in the Service of and Through Problem Solving, comes out in 2023 and is the first of his Dare to Invent the Future trilogy that will be published by the MIT Press. His professional interests lie in the history, theory, and practice of science, technology, innovation, and entrepreneurship in the international context with a focus on Africa. Dr. Mavhunga joined MIT as a tenure-track assistant professor in 2008 after completing his PhD at the University of Michigan. His previous books include Transient Workspaces, Technologies of Everyday Innovation in Zimbabwe, the edited volume, What Do Science, Technology, and Innovation Mean to Africa, and the mobile workshop, The Tsetse Fly in African Knowledge Production. He also convenes the graduate super seminar on Global South cosmologies and epistemologies alongside distinguished theorists from the Global South. He characterizes his work as knowledge in the service of and through problem solving, wherein theory is a product of and informs an ethic of responsibility to community, so that especially faculty and students from marginalized communities carry their community's priorities to shape what they do on campus while drawing the university to communities to engage in learning and solving at the intersection of multiple forms of knowing. Dr. Mavhunga will draw from his ongoing work in Zimbabwe and in Western Massachusetts. We welcome you to Baruch and to CUNY and virtually to New York. Thank you, Dr. Mavhunga. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Interestingly, I grew up listening to the Wailers.
Me too.
I used to like all three without any kind of nitpicking. In part because of the inspiration that draws from what I would call creative resilience in their lives. Other than Barney Livingstone Whaler.
Yeah.
The other two whalers were very poor. I also grew up listening to dub music. Lee Scratch Perry.
Me too.
And Uri were my big gongs, the tough gongs, as it were.
It's funny.
So and the reason why I bring this up is because of the nature of the talk that I will give momentarily. So thank you for inviting me to Baruch. When Erica invited me, I could not say no, precisely because of the importance of asking the question of knowledge in the service of and through problem solving today. You can sense a kind of dissatisfaction with the way that knowledge about Africa and all things that have to do with the Black world have proceeded, but particularly in terms of, if you looked at, if you heard my opening remarks about the whalers and Scratch, among many other reggae luminaries, they were able to invent a musical system that went on to influence everything we know about music from very humble origins. And so that's where I honed my skills on the dance floor, but also a kind of rebel culture around matters of knowledge. I'm going to be speaking today not just as an academic. I prefer to call myself an intellectual, less of an academic. I also prefer to call myself less of an intellectual and much more of a critical thinker, doer, in part because I believe that the knowledge we have been producing has focused too much on the academic side of things and neglected the part where we need to, if we so believe in these knowledge systems, we need to think of them in two particular ways. Number one, if it is the case that our knowledges were colonialism interrupted our knowledges, killed our knowledges, some of them, or deflected them, the question then becomes, where was that knowledge going? What was its trajectory? What was its state at the moment at which colonialism barged in uninvited? Secondly, and this becomes an operational question, now that we have summoned the courage to say, where was it going? Where could it go? In other words, where could I, as I begin to ponder, take this knowledge? Let's not for a moment think that writing a work of poetry or publishing a book is enough. Based on that question, it's not. That's not what I mean by where could we take it. We'll do that. But we would be going along with a very colonial framing of what knowledge is, or the ends of knowledge. So even as we write wonderful critiques about the colonial and reconstruct our own narratives, we are still limited by the fact that, or oblivion to the fact that griots, court jesters, the best poets still could feed themselves. I don't know of any poet in my Zimbabwean ancestry who just stood there or waited there to do poetry alone. Who would feed that person? Nobody. I know that this is a very uncomfortable proposition. A friend of mine, friendships have ended over this. A friend of mine once reminded me that all of it, esemabasa, all of it is work, Chakanetsa. If I write a work of poetry, that's work. I agree. At the same time, it's painful to see that things we call art or speculations that we write or paint, art that we conjure, goes on to become raw materials for speculative design and technologies that outside our hands go on to define our lives. And then we turn around and say they stole our knowledge. Question is, what did we do with that knowledge? I think sometimes we end too soon. Just as the drumbeat is beginning to get exciting, just as the calabash is getting filled with our brew, and all of us are just getting ready to start beating the drum and dancing. And then as these rhythms begin to go, we end the party. I think we need to dare to invent the future. In my own small world, what I did was to transform my village, my homestead, into a catalytic space where I could return to my own people. Because there is a lot of amnesia, there is a lot of skepticism about our own knowledge systems. In a world that is driven by Western capital, and the market dynamic, we begin to feel that we do not have anything to contribute. That's what colonialism said to us. And it hammered that a kind of mindset into us at the pain of the chicote, this jambok, the whip, and sometimes at the pain of death. So we take courage from the colonial trauma by realizing that even then, when death was certain and our backs were against the wall, we did not just roll over and die, nor did we just die fighting. In Zimbabwe, we defeated colonialism. So that's where the courage comes from. That is where the sense of daring should come from. It comes from the dragons that we have slain in the past. Understanding that we have to lay the foundations to slay dragons in our present and future time. And I chose to slay my own dragons in this site, which I call Ruzivo Dudziro Basa, which loosely translates to research, design, build. And I wanted to inspire myself to be the catalyst. Briefly, this is the emerging architecture of this catalytic space, which is populated by multidisciplinary problem solving. That's what I mean by MDPS. It will have all the things that we have traveled around the world, seen, de-linked from being colonial or Western knowledge, re-Africanized, because a lot of the ingredients that went into the knowledge systems of the global north were taken from us through expeditions that went to extract our knowledge about plants, our knowledge about the environment, knowledge about making things, sometimes at gunpoint. When you look at the history of Congo, Rwanda, South Africa, Zimbabwe in particular, there are many other archives. I have seen copious amounts of notes, very detailed, in the Tervuren Museum in Belgium, in the Smithsonian in the United States, and in the South African archives and museums, of knowledge that was produced, that was extracted from our ancestors at gunpoint. For plant knowledge in particular, witchcraft was, they called it witchcraft. Then they emphasized the witch while stealing the craft. And we just think that this is a kind of, you saw this in Haiti with the pufferfish. The story goes on and on and on and on. So the point is made that this was knowledge extracted through duress. We know this. We know what we have not done is to not simply study ourselves and say, Africa was great. Oh, how great we were. We had great ancestors. We know that. And yet, as Biola Irele once said, it is of no use now to talk about ancestors, our ancestors having built ancient Egypt, Great Zimbabwe, Timbuktu. And yet, our roads are flowing with sewage. Our houses are still being made with materials that cause cancer, and so forth. The question that Abiola Irele paraphrased as such was getting at was, we need to rethink this knowledge as knowledge that is necessary for solving our own problems. To be fair, projects like this have been done. The sterling work of Cheikh under Dupe, which Africans should not have unnecessarily ignored and be distracted by European critics, should have built on that firm foundation in order to wonder where was it that knowledge was gone. And these are roads not taken, roads that should have been taken, but were not. So the whole exercise in establishing this kind of structure is to populate it with our own idioms and to create a different space where we can engage with the future. And by future, I mean our children, and our children who engage their own children. Beyond simply thinking of the academic silo. The academic silo was not built for Africans. The academic silo had worked very well for Europe because Europe had industrialized at our expense. We were consigned to being just a raw material base. Meanwhile, they were busy building entire foundries to process gold when they did not have gold themselves, to process our palm oil when they had no single palm oil tree. These are historical facts. And we have got to confront the fact that Africa is one continent that continues to export its resources raw. One of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest, natural resource regions in the world exports its resources raw to enrich other nations. The same can be said of the impoverishment of the rural countryside and its transformation within Africa itself into the raw material base for the city, which when economists tell us that by a certain date, 2050 or 2030, or whatever their favorite date is, the majority of Africans will be living in the city. And we gobble up these statistics. We do not see the strawman's argument there. that, yes, if you train an entire generation towards the assumption of the importance of the city as a magnet, what you are doing there is to drain out the essence and attractiveness of the rural and the priorities that ought to be accorded to it. And that kind of assumption leads us to an either-or scenario. As a Zimbabwean, I am happy to say that for the first time, the country will have a surplus in wheat. For the first time in the last 2 decades, it will have a surplus in wheat. Why is this significant? Precisely because it is an on-the-ground rejection of that either-or. The people who are farming are not simply living in rural areas. They are living in urban areas. And they cut the whole gamut. So on the ground, what we are seeing, when I speak of things that I'm about to show you, I speak from a Zimbabwean reality in which hardship has created a certain amount of creative resilience among the people. How do you survive when the economy is not functioning, when your country can't borrow from the IMF and World Bank, and you have to survive? Part of what is going on is that there is this educative space called growing up, which I want to spend the rest of my time on. In that experience, this is where the informal economy resides. It's informalized economy, not informal. Because we were told that that formal economy is the only economy, and it has to operate on a system that is recognizable in the Western lexicon. On the ground, however, you find in a majority of countries that the informalized space is where the economy is taking place. How do we explain the resilience and indefatigable nature of the rural or the everyday or the informal, for that matter? It's in view of how we grow up in circumstances that require that you either have to be resilient or you are not going to make it. That's the African majority. There will be a few who are now very well up in the city, but they are exactly that, the few. Resilience is not simply muscle. It's not having a thick skin only. There is that. But it is anchored deeply and is downstream of what one would call creativity, hence creative resilience. And so with that background, I am going to briefly orientate you to where I grew up, and then I will shut up and then just to show you the slides. This is an African's rethinking of immersive technologies. And I want people to communicate with the images and to read the text that accompanies it. This is where I grew up. That's where I did a lot of things. It's in central, northeastern Zimbabwe, and Zimbabwe is just north of South Africa. And with that, welcome to my childhood, in which I was born very poor, grew up poor. And that was what I call my open laboratory. So this is me in Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts. This is not in Zimbabwe. I am an avid farmer, and I'm now at a stage in my life when I'm trying to combine my passion for farming with my ethic of responsibility to community and to inspire young people to realize that for marginalized communities to, particularly historically marginalized communities, to succeed, they have to play the leading role. Government programs alone are not going to do it. In Africa, certainly, donors are definitely not going to do it. In fact, what we are seeing in some countries like Zimbabwe, we are seeing much closer scrutiny, part politically expedient, but also if an effect to streamline how these agencies, do what they do. We have seen a massive erosion of self-reliance since the times I grew up in the 80s to a present time where if you go to try and initiate projects, people will simply just think you're coming with the money and they sit there and expect to be paid. This is the kind of a kind of amnesia that, and in the kind of deflection of our knowledge and practices that I was talking about earlier. So why maize? Precisely because the one thing that Africans eat very well is maize from home. This is not sweet corn. It's the less sweet or non-sweet variety that my father used to farm a lot in Zimbabwe. And he would mix things, do a kind of genetic modification in the field by mixing different bean varieties, different kind of maize varieties, different types of nuts, etc., etc., etc. And so I am simply trying to bring people of African descent, and not just that, I have noticed now that this is a way of building bridges across the entire Global South. It exemplifies what Global South means in terms of taste, by which I define Global South not as a geographical, physical location, but people who have been marked by the colonial, by the legacy of colonialism, racism, and slavery. And it's been wonderful to actually bring that kind of feeling together. I'm at a stage now where I'm expanding this now to mentor kids, especially, kids that have got single moms, have no dad in the house, require at least somebody they can look up to who is male so that they can model themselves. Most of these kids are my kids' friends, or their mothers are my wife's friends. And so I have had to, this is not a role I found, it's a role that has found me. And I'm in the process now of seeing if I can work with local schools where these kids attend. Some of these schools do not have after-school programs. Those kids, when they leave and they go home, they don't have a parent home because parents are working 3 or 4 shifts, sometimes almost non-stop for 24 hours. And so this becomes a space where, through farming, you can begin to mentor kids to believe that there's another kind of fun that can be had. If they take a can and that's fine. And then they take all these vegetables, mom is coming back from work, they are bringing in all these nice leaf vegetables. They will feel like, they are contributing to the household. Not just boys, girls, every little kid should not be left behind. All right, I will stop there for now. And then if I need to elaborate, I will do that. But the key thing that I leave you with is I am worried that I teach engineers. They can breeze through an MIT education without actually knowing the purpose for which these tools, the immense possibilities these tools could be deployed to. Those that take my course always end up saying, I wish I had taken this course first, because then I would know exactly what type of courses I need to take, because these are instruments that I need to change the lot of my own people. I believe that our education system does not instill a sense of responsibility to our communities. The consequence of it is to assume that for some reason, students will find this somehow when they grow up. And part of what I'm trying to do is to reframe my approach. And this is where I end up. 3 years ago, I told my students that next time I teach a class, I will not be telling students what I would like to do or what could be done to change Africa or to change the realities that we see need to change. I will be saying, this is what I have done, or this is what I am doing. Because I believe that as the professoriate, it may not be our role to sweat, but let's remember, that's exactly what colonialism intended. It wanted to make us believe that any sweat is anathema to being educated. Our education was supposed to deliver us from hard work, hard back-breaking work. And therefore, it put us in a narrow tunnel of vision where success lay in the academic track. The idea was to assimilate us to white society. It could be the assimilage in the case of Portuguese colonies. It could be evolue in the case of the French. It could be anything, the case is made that it was designed to lift us away, uproot us from our people, place us in suspended animation, groping to be recognized as white, at the same time not being accorded that status, but having this superiority complex that we are too good to be like these tribesmen and tribeswomen below us. My career and my legacy, I wanted to be remembered as one about trying to attack that kind of self-mortalizing, to quote D.A. Masolo, self-mortalizing, self-harm kind of mode. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mavhunga. I am so excited. Well, first I will say that I was a little nervous because I thought as an English professor and as a professor of Black studies, that I wouldn't know what to say to an engineer or a professor at MIT.
No.
I know, and now, oh my gosh, we could talk forever.
Yeah.
And so I'm gonna first begin with 2 comments or 3 comments and a question, and I'll try to be quick because hopefully people in this audience have questions or comments of their own. The first is is just love. I love that you brought up your connection to Bob Marley, Robert Nesta Marley, and Lee Scratch Perry, partly because my Caribbean roots and your African roots are roots that we share, right? That, you know, they overlap. And this idea that the rebel music that they produced also educated us about a sense of responsibility to the communities that are rebelling against the colonial system. So thank you for that. Thank you also for reminding us that academic knowledge is not enough, that the decolonial project understands knowledge in the service of something. You know, Black feminists talk about this knowledge in the service of action in the service of our communities' freedom and liberation. And I think about this as a liberatory practice. And as the chair of Black and Latino studies, and a new major at Baruch, by the way, Black studies and Latinx studies, we built a major designed for students to be able to have an opportunity to go work in the field, to be able to apply what they're learning in the classroom to racial and social justice. So it's really exciting. It's surprising the gift that Erica and Zach assigned me to be in conversation with you. So thank you for that. And third, I'm thinking about Africa, and I'm thinking about what you said about what I'm calling indigenous knowledge, and your presentation here asking us to really take seriously indigenous knowledge and come back to it as a source of not just our power and pride in our cultures and our backgrounds, but also as solutions to some of the challenges that we face now in the 21st century. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about not just Zimbabwe. I don't know a lot about the nature-based solutions in the continent of Africa, but I know a little bit about what's going on in the forests in Zimbabwe and in Gabon and in the Congo. And, you know, those regions, those countries also happen, for everyone else in the room, they also happen to have some of the largest rainforests in the world. And those trees also house some of the most protected and rare animals in the world, and plants in the world, and the knowledges that come from interacting with those animals and plants. So I really appreciate your presentation of even growing up as a child, interacting with big animals and little animals, and your experience with plants and the knowledges that come from plants, that you, even as a child, understood your relationship to all kinds of beings, living beings, not just human beings, and that our sort of ecologies and our interactions are respect for the spaces and the opportunities that the life that they create for us is a very important part of building a future. So I wonder if you could say more for us about how we could how across disciplines we can start to recognize indigenous knowledge or local knowledges as part of our solution-based practices across the disciplines, across not just engineering and science, but also, as you mentioned, poetry.
Thanks. Part of the reason for establishing the Global South Cosmologies and Epistemologies Initiative was to question the premises for the discipline, and the discipline as a space of control, which is circumscribed by certain codes of knowing that were established without our invitation to the conversation.
Yeah.
And part of what I've spent my career doing is to say, since we have not been invited initially, and we take that as, to put it mildly, as a discourteous historical event, now that we are there, I think we should go back and question that premise of the discipline to go beyond simply slotting in and being comfortable in our titles.
Absolutely.
Very easy to do that.
Yes.
And to say that, how do our own ancestors order knowledge? And knowledge for what purpose? Because I don't know anything that had no effect or did not operate something in our system that was not a force towards something, or speak to that force as worth preserving. It could be a force, say, to compel you to go into the forest and hunt, and you would come back with meat, or to look for mushrooms and come back with relish, to go there to look for medicines, plants, and you needed an encyclopedic knowledge of plants.
Yeah. That
knowledge is worth preserving and can only continue to flourish only and only if it is practiced and it fulfills a real material purpose. The basis for inventing the religions we invented for ourselves, the spiritualities we invented for ourselves, was to address a very specific material need to live. And most of the technologies that we assembled were driven by, given operating principles by that spiritual ordering. How we look at the world. We can't just set aside our belief systems, our myths, and take only the myths that, the taboos that drive the space in which women make pots, for example, pottery, or men make metals, both being processes of turning dirt into technologies. We can't just say, oh, we don't want this crazy stuff, as they call it. Those that, and when I say they, I mean people who know absolutely nothing about African originated or indigenous cultures. Nothing, zero. They are armed with nothing other than their biases and their lack of education about other people's cultures. Because they are not immersed in those idioms. We, on the other hand, are privy to our own knowledge systems, the knowledge of self, and self as communal, not individual. We know ourselves. And we are coming to other cultures that have hegemonic tendencies. And we have pillaged that archive as well, imbibed everything it has to offer. We have been there, we bought the t-shirt. There is nothing to see there. We have set aside the biases that constrict it into a Western knowledge system or a Western and white knowledge system.
Yes.
And said, yeah, I'll take that, I'll take that, I'll take that, I'll take that. The same move they made yesterday.
Mm.
And but we are not colonizing anybody.
Right on. It's funny
So,
what you're, yeah.
So what we are saying here is that when we talk about these issues, we should dare to generalize them to a much larger swath of knowledge systems and why they have to be reconfigured. I am simply worried that we are still knowing in the frame, we are trapped in the Western and white-centric frame for the reasons why we want to know. To write a book, bamboozle the audiences, publish, get tenure. And so that's our day job. Let's do that. But what beyond that?
Yes, there's some really lively comments in the chat. Erica and Angie are noting that you emphasize, they love the way you emphasize the witch while stealing the craft. And yeah. I'm thinking about this when you also invited us, at least the way I understand it, you invited us to question the very idea of disciplinary practice. Yeah. And in another conversation this week, we were talking about the disciplinary practice as a racist practice, really, particularly because it creates a sort of Hunger Games, if you will, of higher ed, so that, you know, in the economics class or the accounting class, only 3 people can get an A. And a student told me yesterday in a Black and Latinx studies class, she came out of her accounting class and the professor gave them an exam and said, most of you will fail.
Yeah.
Said this to a room full of color. You know, most of you will fail, and that's sort of soul crushing. So that being able to find that power in the self as you're describing it, being able to understand that the witch has a craft, being able to apply the knowledge that we have.
Why don't we go there?
Yes.
Why don't we go there?
Yes, go there.
You have beliefs in witchcraft that end up with what do you call it? Virtual reality, augmented reality, immersive technology. Take your pick. Those are beliefs that are turned into actual gadgets.
Yeah.
In Zimbabwe, a few examples will do. One example, the Roshi people had observed the moon. They thought this was a shiny, nice plate which had all these engravings. And so they resolved to build a platform to go and take the moon and present it as the ultimate gift to their monarch. And they started building the ladder. Cut a lot of wood, started building, cut a lot of wood. Those that one can say, oh, they cut too many trees, endangered the planet, yada, yada, yada. That's fine. I am much more interested. There is another group, which is Zimbabweans. They'll say, there was, you know, this was very superstitious people. They laugh at that story. And I'm sitting here at MIT and I'm saying, what was going to happen if the Roshi kept thinking on how to get to the moon? The story changes to how to get to the moon.
Yeah.
So when people like Kennedy and so forth and the scientists, and we glorify those stories.
Mm-hmm.
And we sing hallelujah to those stories. We don't talk about these Roshi who began to think as early as the 1500s that it is possible to get to the moon.
Mm.
How stupid can we be that we commit ourselves to being dead before science.
Yeah.
Because this is where things begin. Again, I don't know any Zimbabwean who has asked this story to say, no, I don't think that if that's a funny story. The Roche wanted to get to the moon in the 1500s.
Mm-hmm.
We are the ancestors of the Roche. 500 years later, can't we, Zimbabwe, can't Africa begin to have a program where they send people into space?
Yes,
Yes, they can.
yes.
And without that threshold of not vain hope, but informed inspiration,
Yeah.
we can begin to say that we are descended from ancestors who imagined it was possible to do frontier things. This is the ultimate moonshot.
Yes. I'm thinking about another great example that fits into what you're saying is to get back to agriculture. People are now calling it biodynamic farming, right? Yeah. You prune your plants at the full moon, and you think about planting seasons based on the moon cycles. And now, all these very fancy winemakers in Europe are pruning their grapes according to the moon, and they're charging a lot extra for it. And a whole bunch of people here in New York City are paying extra for their biodynamic wine and their biodynamic plants, which is kind of what our ancestors have been doing for centuries. And that is another great example. People think, oh, that's so superstitious. Well, try it. Before
kombucha.
Yeah.
And there's now, they call it kefir milk. Kefir.
Oh, yeah.
Would remind them that kefir is the N-word.
Yeah.
That's what it basically means in South Africa and Zimbabwe and in colonial Africa. Period. Yes. I think they should just change the name. But if you think of that, that's fermentation. You see, what I'm trying to do, I will let people who are feminists do that. I am simply a son who is writing the knowledges of my mother as one of the greatest inventors and innovators I ever saw. Why? Because I need my daughter and sons to realize that they are descended from a great woman. Because she was a brewer of beer. She was a fermenter of things. We talk about, anaerobic bacteria, aerobic bacteria, and all this stuff. Bring a mountain of stars on top of it as words. We don't care. She did these things in practice. And they called it yogurt here. And to hide the fact that this was a fermented milk. And we do not see that what we got there were the contents. This is where I don't understand we Africans. This is why I'm going back to this stuff. And why my new book, Trilogy, is dedicated to young Africans, home and abroad. Because we are eulogizing the content, kombucha, kefir milk. We are not talking about the container that made it all possible. And the process of how you arrive at all this fermentation and how you go through brewing all this beer and it achieves an alcoholic content.
Yeah.
And we just think, oh, the day will always shine, so what? No, the day is not going to shine on Africa. Africa is more like, somebody told me today, Africa is like a sunflower. It follows the direction of the West. Osman Sembene once said this. We don't see our own sun shining from our own knowledge systems. The act of producing a pot, and the pot the manipulation of all these room temperatures in order to produce favorable conditions. Let's go into science. Favorable conditions for fermenting, whether it's grain mixed with this, a malt prepared under very specific conditions of immersing it in the river for specific periods. This is my mother talking. Taking it out, taking it to what is called ruware, this flat rock, and putting it in the sun to dry. And then roasting it for a little bit. And then, why did they do this? At each of these meticulous phases.
Yeah.
Until you get a very specific taste. A taste that, along with music, was the fabric that wove our societies together.
Yes.
What about that? Now, these days, I see a lot of people that are now commercializing this and making it personal property. Yeah. I think what we need to resolve is that Africa, one did not think in any society that I know, it wasn't a sum total of individuals, but individuals were elements of the communal. As they would say, and Senghor would say as well, communal, yes. Collective, absolutely not. Because the West begins with the individual who collectivizes out of insecurity. Africans tended to be communal, and individuals were always accounted for in view of everybody's welfare being the fabric that weaves society together.
That's really great. Thinking about community, and there's so much to say. There's this, the chat is getting lively. So there is a person named Thembo Rabson from Uganda who writes that he is Ugandan, and he's describing his history is similar to yours. And in Uganda, grassroots organizations are facing its threats from government. And his government has gone an extra mile of silencing anyone who advocates for protection of ecosystems and climate change mitigations to the extent that at times where disasters occur due to impacts of climate change, and organizations that try to give emergency rapid responses, supports are targeted and most times tortured and unable to proceed with the work. His question is, what advice or approaches can you recommend for us, the young climate change activists, to use in order to escape from threats from the state?
Right. I don't know what strategies they use. I'm not here to prescribe. I like Sankara once said, I don't come to you as a prophet. I don't bear any truths. By the way, I actively encourage young people to read Thomas Sankara. I really do.
Thomas Sankara?
Thomas Sankara.
Can you spell his last name?
The book is called Sankara Speaks. This is the way I took the title from my new trilogy. It's called Dare to Invent the Future. So you are saying I'm not a bearer of any truths. I'm simply I'm seized with just trying to create a society, conditions for the happiness of the people. That's the world I'm trying to create.
I love that. Happiness. This is something too,
yeah.
People talk about Black liberation, not just in Africa, but globally. Very often, sometimes people, liberal mindsets sometimes focus so much on the hardship, focus so much on the suffering, and they forget the joy, the creativity, the ingenuity. So when you bring up music, when you talk about your mother's food, and we talk about dancing, it's also recognizing that, Black people create beauty and joy. And
oh my God. That's why I was conflicted, because I could have given any one of several talks.
Yeah.
Because of the need to be happy. I'll answer that question. I went to northern Uganda at the invitation of a friend who runs a non-profit that he founded. Went through the western side until we got to Lira, just off Gulu, where the Lord's Resistance Army was operative. My purpose was simple. I wanted to go there and drink taste of beer brewed by the mothers there that brew this brew. It was wonderful. It reminded me a lot about my mom and what I could have done to mix these two archives, no longer as archives, but as two communities that were practicing this knowledge, and to share brewing styles, even to mix, to share materials for brewing. The imagination was as far as the eye could see. Here's what I think. I'll be very blunt about what's going on in Africa, not just in Uganda. Number one, for the longest time, some of us engaged in critiques of the political situation. We were forced into a situation under the regime of our late president, whom you cannot judge from start to finish from one location in time or in terms of perception. There is the Robert Mugabe who sent us all to school for free. We had the best healthcare system in the world, etc., etc. Then there's the one who, after 1995, took a different path. But the point is this, that we, as academics, most of them were trapped into this. There is a tendency to then join politics so that you can be seen to be coming back home to fight the good fight. That's fine. Then there is the part where you care for the people deeply, care for your area deeply. But you also oppose very, very viciously the incumbent government. The odds of you being able to reach and partner and be in solidarity with the people you care for becomes compromised. You are not going to be able to do your work freely because it is already marked as oppositional. Part of what is happening with African academia has been that we have overwhelmingly had most of us are critics who do nothing, and doers who are not critical thinkers. Whereas what we need on the continent is people that do both. My experience in Zimbabwe has been that it's easy to criticize on this side. It's very easy. If you are going to be a critic of government, they will just shut the door in your face or shut you. We still have in Africa a situation where people don't knock on your door to ask your vote. They may actually beat the vote out of you. It's a choice that we have to face, that those are the conditions under which we have to make impact. The politics is not going to be right before we start being innovative agents and catalysts, period. At best, we can be part of the catalysis, but at the end of the day, we must realize that we can't both be critics of government and expect them to open their doors to us. That can't happen. I'm not saying that's what the question from Uganda is concerned with. I'm just saying in my own life, I took the decisions that I want to go and operate in my own little village, where I come in now as a fairly elder. I didn't just get tenured by MIT, the people tenured me. I tried to insist that they use my first name. They refused. that we are tenuring you now in case you did not know. So that's what it became. I advise my counselor strategically. This is where it becomes interesting. I give him strategic advice on the technical questions that and the approaches, the kind of diplomacy that you need in order to achieve impact. I don't have to be the leader who is visibly the leader. I am the force behind the leader who is visible and building a constituency in the hearts of the people. We have to rethink what we mean by action. It's not always critique. It can be very deeply practical things, like going back to tell them that, look, from what I know of engineering, all those, round passageways underneath the bridge where water comes through, designed after independence to avoid flooding for days and to drain the water quickly, have had the consequence of creating a desert where we used to have, if water clogged, it would block the arteries, the water table would rise, and we would have springs flourishing. We have got to influence the government from our village and our ward to change this.
Yeah.
It's from the village that I've been making impact, including on government policy. So, for example, my ward councillor has been elevated in position now, both as part of the nationwide councillors, but also as part of, he is being asked to join boards, like the Where Dam project resulted in him being invited to apply and eventually joining the National Water Management Authority of that particular catchment, which is the biggest water catchment in the country. Long story short, I would encourage young people to rethink what it means to be a leader. Otherwise, my worry is that you are blocking what can otherwise be very good partnerships with government. Because politicians understand one thing: they want votes. They can either gain votes through what you're doing or lose votes through shunning what you're doing. So at the same time, you want to change the lot of the people who vote for the government. The language in general across Africa regarding environmentalism has been deeply confrontational. For better or worse, it is sometimes funded by non-African NGOs. And that ticks off African leaders. If we are going to be impactful, we have to rethink our strategy. Where are the compromises we can make in order to achieve long-term impact?
That's so great. It reminds me again of Bob Marley, what you said, that song, Small Axe. If you are a big tree,
yes,
we are a small axe. And the axe will eventually cut down the tree. So
I love the Euro version though.
Yeah.
That's a more, The Mali one, I listen to it when I'm riding.
Yeah, me too.
Euro one, I listen to it when the ideas have really come out, and I'm like, yeah, that's what I wanted to say.
That's awesome. We have a few minutes left, and there are some questions lingering in the chat. Angie Beeman has a question about children, and Anna has a question about international development work. So before Anna, you take the floor, I'm just going to read Angie's question. She was interested in how your presentation centered on children. And she asks, what strategies can we use in our schools where young children are often controlled to help support resilience rather than what you characterize as sweat and defeat?
Yeah. You see, the crisis of, I don't know, with the Caribbean or in the United States, the crisis of our education system in Africa is that it completely eliminates any place for the home as a space of everyday innovation, creative resilience, and early childhood education. Women who know this, they're our mothers. The first point at which you teach a child is not when they are out of the womb. It's when they are beginning to make those little movements. And out of that emerges a bond. In Zimbabwe, when we cry, we don't say, Baba, Baba, no, Father. We say, Amai wangu iwe, Amai iwe. Just mother. Cry to the mother. We don't cry to the father. And that's significant because it also says Mushamkadzi in my culture. The home is mother. Mother is home. So there is something that is going on here that I think references a need to rethink things with that mindset of caring associated with motherhood. And I feel like that sense of caring is lost in the education system because it takes that care, ethic of care out of the equation and places the child at the mercy of the education system, which sets a national exam, completely eliminating these very intimate local conditions of upbringing and learning.
Yeah.
And I am telling you, I am going back to my knowledge because I'm shocked every time I go back with what we used to do. Very interesting modes of chemistry, like making bird lime, rubber, out of rubber trees with just fire and a bit of oil. So I want us to really think through the possibility of integrating the home space and the academic space, reframed so that the academic does not simply slavishly conform to disciplines. In Zimbabwe, we are beginning to see the breakdown of history itself. It's beginning to be more about heritage studies. It's the anthropology is being dissolved into 10,000 other things that reintegrate it into the way our ancestors used to think. Because there is now a disjuncture between history, language, and culture, which is what linguistics, anthropology, and history does. And then there is archaeology, busy turning upside down the places where our ancestral spirits are supposed to live.
Yeah.
So whose knowledge is it? So we have to recenter the homestead and the role of the parent as the first stage in which a child is introduced to education. And it will never be the last. Every time I was getting wayward in college, I would go back to my village, and my mother and father would spend the whole night talking. That's how I kept grounded.
There is, we are really at 2:30. We started a little late, and I know there's one more question. If you have time, then
I have time.
I'm so excited. I'm really glad that we got to have this conversation, Dr. Mavhunga. I can't believe my luck that I got paired with you. But Anna D'Souza in the Mark School, an economist, has a question for you. And Anna, if you can make it brief so we can have this last question answered.
Yes.
And
very brief.
Yes.
Very brief. I just can't like type the question while I'm listening in the middle. Okay. So I'm a development economist, and what I'm curious about, I mean, you've mentioned a little bit about how your approach has been very narrow and local, right? You're going back to that. You're starting from that, from where you grew up. I'm curious as to some of the, let's call them liberatory, or what you've described here is a really, it's a very anti-white supremacist, anti-colonial. There are these other larger kind of forces that you're tapping into in your discussion here. And I'd like to know, if for the development community, the international development community that has been, come out of colonization, come out of all these, it's basically, the white supremacist mentality writ large throughout the world with all the power and all the things that you know already. And so I'm just kind of curious as to if you hear some of these discussions taking place in your spaces, in this idea, because I go to places like with Shelly and Eric and other folks where they're talking about this, like, these in the humanities basically, okay? And there the discussion is very much about like anti-colonial mind. Okay, I don't hear that happening in economics or development economics. I don't know if it's happening in engineering, but since you're in that space, I'm just curious as to, on the, in the spaces that you're at. I know you're at MIT, but when you're in the continent and you mentioned Zimbabwe education there, I'm just curious as to if you can give me, at least as an economist, a little bit hope that there are some of these discussions taking place, that we're not continuing to replicate the same things, even though we're talking about more participation at the local level.
Yeah, there is beginning to be not simply, it's a kind of space where Africans are trying to forge their own destinies. It being the view that even a decolonial option for some of us is not enough. It still circumscribes and recenters the colonial. We, in a panel that we did for videography in the hands of the people with artists, we chose not to talk about colonialism. Because we felt we understand these experiences. They have weighed us down. The moment we start doing that, we become the victim and we talk from the victim perspective. When there is a lot that's already happening in which people need a sense of guidance and grounding so that people understand what they are doing locally is important as exemplars globally or across the Black world or across Africa. So there is a sense in which people are beginning to be fed up with the education system on the ground. What's causing this mass unemployment? You go, you graduate, you have a PhD, you have a master's, you can't get a job. It's an education system designed to put you in the line to get a job. It's not anything you can use anything for. World Bank, IMF will come and say, yeah, we need you to train more STEM. Great, wonderful. But unaware that even here in the United States, at MIT more so, there has been a strong pushback now to say STEM is not enough. Without caring, some of us think without an ethic of responsibility to community, there is simply no way an engineer will not be anything other than a glorified mechanic. And a mechanic can sort your car. But how many engineers in Africa have invented a car? The cars that you hear being invented, most of them are just in France for Silicon Valley or white money. You go to Nairobi, you think you are in Wyoming, a very white place. What's going on there? Because people are tapping into it's Silicon Valley money. It's Silicon Valley money. What will happen when the lights go out? When like in Zimbabwe, we saw there's deindustrialization because you are now taking back the wealth and putting it back to local people. There will be capital of light, and you'll be left clutching at figments of a bygone era in which you never controlled anything.
Right on.
So I want to see a kind of economic focus. And this is coming. You are not going to stop Africa because we are already, if not there, very soon, the youngest population in the world.
That's really
the rest of these continents are going to run out of labor. And what do you think will happen? So if we are not careful, we are going to end up being a vast reservoir of cheap labor.
Yeah.
And we Africans have to start thinking about that as priority number one. If we are going to be overseas, We should now be thinking, just as in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, about a connected one struggle. It doesn't matter whether you're in Harlem. It doesn't matter whether you're in Paris. It doesn't matter whether you're in Senegal or in South Africa. It was one struggle for the emancipation of the race. There was a time when we have been distracted. We are probably still very distracted by these very internal, in my sense, very particularistic battles. Some of them are designed to scatter us so that we don't have a large force. Africa has 54 countries now. Whenever we appear to be speaking with one voice and moving towards one Africa, one or two leaders die. So we have to think about these dynamics, but I refuse to think about what outsiders are doing in Africa. I don't care. I care very much about what we Africans are doing to ourselves by allowing outsiders that to have this power.
Right on.
That's something in our power to solve. Even in the United States, we can begin to impact what happens in Africa. If we want change in Africa, we can demand that we want change. We have a lot of money that we are sending to Africa. Of course, people say, our family will starve if we do not send money home. Okay, I get that. And I'll end there.
That is fantastic. And it's really inspiring. And I appreciate you very much. I appreciate your directness, especially when it comes to self-determination, not just for African peoples, but for all of us as we stand here thinking about Black liberations. And I say liberations plural because every continent and country has different needs, but the fact remains self-determination seems like the common denominator, and trusting the knowledge that comes from within. So thank you very much. I'm going to pass the mic to our host, Erica Richardson. And thank you, Dr. Mavhunga. It was an incredible pleasure to be in conversation with you. Thank you.
Absolutely. I just want to echo what Shelly said. This was such an incredible conversation. And actually also say the thing I'm walking away with, thinking about just that movement from recognizing what happens in the home, what your mom is doing, what mama's doing. It is a form of knowledge production. You know, can also, in recognizing that, where are our open laboratories? That's what I keep thinking about. Where are open laboratories? How do they emerge? How do we recognize them around us? And I think something else that really resonated with me was that care can be a route for that. Care and happiness can be a way of creation, of building these structures and sharing this knowledge in a community like the one we're building with this series, with the symposium, and in this digital room. So again, I just want to thank everyone so much for coming out and say that there will be recordings of this made available. Thank you so much, Dr. Mavhunga, for your work. This has been a brilliant, exciting presentation. And on that note, I'm now going to stop the recording.